Okay, guys, good morning. How are you? Hope you're well. Just got about 2 minutes until it's class time, so just getting the stream rolling for now. Eddie's up here. Don't always see him. Hey, Eddie. Morning, Jerry. Hey. Hey there, Naaman, Melanie. Good morning, guys. Allison, welcome back. Hi, Kevin. Brittany, Janice, Sophia, Mia, good to see you. Okay. Sergio, Sebastian, Gloria, Angel, Cameron, good morning, everyone. Hi, Alexis. Good to see you guys. Hi, Katan, Jocelyn, Maybelline, Angel, Mark. Okay, we're almost ready to go. Hey, Ivan. Okay, guys, so let's go ahead and get things rolling. It's 10 a.m., so welcome back. Hope you're all having a good week. Basically, we're just going to continue working all through these last couple of essays on philosophy of mind. We have 2 more authors on this subject, and today we'll at least go over Jjc Smart's article, and if we can, we'll at least start talking about Alan Turing at the end. But yeah, that's the plan for today. And keep in mind, just so that everyone doesn't forget and has the schedule in mind, that your second essay will be due Tuesday, May 11th, anytime prior to class time on that Tuesday. So you still have a little ways to go. There's still 12 days until then, so you have more time to work, but you should at least perhaps start thinking about identifying a topic and getting your notes collected. But all right then, so cool. As usual, make sure to leave behind some type of comment, and at any time, feel free to ask any questions or interject at any point into the conversation while we're talking about this stuff. Okay, and good to see everybody that's arriving to the meeting. Welcome back, one and all. Yeah, so I'll start off by just reviewing the last meeting's topic and some of the basic information that we went through there. So on Tuesday, we basically went over the article by Daniel Stoljar, which is called Physicalism. And in the philosophy of mind, there's these 2 different views, monism and dualism. The kind of monism that we're mostly looking at is physicalist monism, which says that every single thing in the universe is just made out of matter. There's only matter. Matter makes up everything. Everything's made out of atoms. Even minds, consciousness, etc. That's all just made out of the brain and the physical states of it. Dualism is the opposite idea that there's 2 substances that make everything up, and they embrace both matter and what's called mind. And in the philosophical usage, the term mind does not refer to the brain, but it refers to some kind of non-material consciousness that does not have any shape, size, or extension into physical space. Now, Descartes gave the argument for dualism that we started the topic with. His argument, which we've covered many times by now, but one last look at it, is just that if you can imagine the mind and body existing separately, and he thinks that clearly you can, that means that they must be able to exist separately, because as he sees it, God is perfectly good and God is real, and that means that God would not allow you to have false perceptions when they're very clear. So he thinks it is very clear that you can imagine the mind and the body existing separately, and therefore they really must be two different things. Now, Daniel Stoljar was our author last time, and he tries to give us the physicalist side of the debate. So Daniel Stoljar says, we need to first of all understand what physicalism means. And as he defines it, it's just the basic claim that everything is physical. Everything is physical, even things that don't seem to be physical, like historical events. They're all physical things, including everything having to do with your consciousness. And if everything is physical, then he says there's two questions that have to be answered to get more in depth on the point. One, what does it mean to say that everything is physical? He calls that the interpretation question. And then the other question he says is the truth question. Is it true that everything's physical? So in terms of that interpretation question, he asks us to consider the idea of supervenience. Okay, now supervenience can be illustrated through the example of a dot matrix picture, or a similar example where you have some kind of composite structure that's made out of a bunch of little elements or parts. Now, can anybody here just briefly say one thing about what is a dot matrix picture? What is it? And that will be useful. Tell me that, just to make sure that everyone, or at least some of us, know. What's a dot matrix picture? Because it's like the core example used to illustrate this notion of supervenience. So I just want to see who can tell me that. Okay, big picture made out of a bunch of tiny dots. Exactly, Kobe, that's right. We see these whenever we look at printed materials on the printed page. When you're looking at digital images, like on a screen, we also have a big picture that's made out of a bunch of tiny little things, but they're not ink dots in this case, rather pixels. Okay, so the point then being that if you have a composite structure which has global features in it that are made out of these little dots, global features just being any large-scale aspect of the composite. So like if you had a big picture on a digital viewing device of like the president signing a bill in the Oval Office, then maybe the pen that he's holding would be one of the global features. Or the suit that he's wearing would be another one of the global features. Or the American flag, perhaps, that's hanging behind would be another one of the global features. So a global feature is just one of the things shown in the composite that is formed out of the little elements. Now, the claim is that if you have two identical matrices, to use the plural, if you had two identical ones in terms of their point-for-point distribution of dots, then they would have to have all the same global features, yeah? And if you had two dot matrices which had different global features, then of course, because there's different global features, there must be different distribution and order of dots below. So the pattern and rule is that same dot distribution, same global features. Different global features, different dot distribution. As compared to the physical universe, then, we hear that the physical universe is also a composite structure. But when it comes to this physical universe, the little elements that form it are rather atoms instead of, dots of ink or pixels. And in the same sense, he says, if we could imagine a second universe which was an atomic physical copy of ours, then it would have all the same global features in it, inclusive of consciousness and all aspects of thought and perception. So if you thought that your brain didn't completely govern your consciousness, if you thought that your consciousness could be thinking of anything, regardless of the physical configuration of your brain, this author is here to say no. If there was a duplicate universe with another doppelganger of you, which was exactly physically identical, then it would have all the same thoughts, feelings, and perceptions that you have had, because what those thoughts, feelings, and perceptions are just supervene on the distribution of atoms in the universe. Sorry. So after that, the author provides a couple of arguments towards the truth of physicalism. One was the argument from Causal Closure, and the other was the argument from Methodological Naturalism, and that's where we ended. Briefly, the argument from Causal Closure says that every event that has a cause has a physical cause. Now, your mind can cause your body to do things. Like you saw, I just opened up this cap and took a drink. That happened physically. It's a physical object being physically opened and depositing some water into me. How did that happen? Well, it happened because I turned the cap. But why did I do it? Because I wanted to, because I thought I need a drink because I'm coughing a little bit right now in my lecture. So the thought that I had and the desire and the decision that I made in my mind led to the physical action that we've all seen right now. And so the argument says that because your behavior is caused by your mind or thought, but because that is a physical cause, and because there's only one cause for each effect, then your mind, which chooses to do things, is simply a physical event of the brain. And that means that everything's physical. Mental events are physical events too. The key premise is kind of the third one, which says that there's only one cause for each effect. So if there's only one cause of your behavior and it's physical, then that would exclude the idea that there's also a separate non-physical cause that works in tandem with the brain to make things happen in your body. Now, the other argument was the argument from methodological naturalism, and we made pretty short work of that. That argument just says that it's always reasonable to believe what the scientific community does, and they believe in physicalism, so that's reasonable for you as well. It's an argument, but in my mind anyway, I think I said that I like the first one better because it gives you a little more substance to consider, whereas the second one, although fair enough, it just kind of says other people will determine for you why the physicalist thesis is correct. And they're a reasonable community of rational people, so if you adopt their views, you inherit their reasonableness. Anyway, I thought that the first argument was a little more interesting to me because it gives you yourself the reasoning behind why physicalism might be true. Okay, so as I usually do, that's just the opening summary of the last meeting to kind of keep everything clear and organized. But now we're going to continue with the next author in the list, and that's this author. So his name is Jjc Smart. And Jjc Smart lived from 1920 until 2012. And this is a paper we're looking at from 1959 of his, which is called Sensations and Brain Processes. Okay, Sensations and Brain Processes, Jjc Smart, from 1959. In a way, the world of philosophy is kind of like a small world, and I mean professional, like academic philosophers and stuff. So there's actually a little slight connection I have to Jjc Smart. I did a book in 2014, co-edited a book with another philosophy professor, and she is a couple generations older than me. She's up in her 70s, but we did this book together, and way back in her youth, she was a student of Jjc Smart herself in graduate school, one of her advisors. So I had that little distant, indirect connection to him. I guess that means that because you have a connection to me, you also have an indirect connection to him, just 1 degree removed. But yeah, he's an interesting philosopher. He's Scottish-born, but worked for a long time in Australia. And he's done work in ethics, but also philosophy of science, which this is all about. And in this paper, he has a pretty straightforward claim that he's trying to make. He's trying to defend the position that sensations are just brain processes. Okay, so really, he states it as like an identity statement, almost like an equation, like sensations just equals brain processes. That's his view, and that's what he's trying to make the case for. Sensations are brain processes. Now, what does this word sensations mean exactly? Okay, let me tell you. He says that, as he's using the term, sensation just refers to any state of consciousness whatsoever. So let me put that here. Okay, so sensations are just any state of consciousness whatsoever. And that's a very broad range. So let me give you some examples of different sensations. What it's like to be watching a philosophy lecture. That's one state of consciousness that you could be in, that I guess right now you are in that state because that's what you're doing. Or the state of consciousness of delivering a philosophy lecture. That's my current state because that's what I'm doing. That's what it's like for me right now. How about the state of consciousness of bungee jumping or riding a bike or playing a musical instrument, or when you eat ice cream and you taste the flavor of it and what it's like to have that experience? That's another state of consciousness. Sometimes it's pain. You bump your elbow on something, ouch, and then you feel the pain. So that's another possible state of consciousness. It could be dreaming. It could be having memories. It could be experiencing pleasure from whatever source. So riding a bike, playing a sport, you know, on and on and on. So fill in the blank. A sensation is just any given conscious state that a mind could be in all their diverse range of possibilities. So what he's saying then in his paper is this: all those states of consciousness that I just mentioned, and all the others that I don't have time to mention, what they are just brain processes. They're just particular configurations of your neural system in the brain. So what is it to have the feeling of eating ice cream? It's just for your brain to be in a given particular state at that time. What is it to feel the pain of smacking your elbow against something? It's just for your brain to be in a particular neurological configuration at that time. Like if we could take a freeze frame of your brain and see which parts of it are active and where there is like neural activity, that would be the same thing as the sensation that you report as a subjective experience. So sensations, states of consciousness, all of them are just brain processes, according to him. And if that is true, then physicalism is true. So Jjc Smart is a physicalist. He's a physicalist because he thinks that consciousness, as interesting as it is, it's just brain processes, which are essentially just physical processes happening with the electrochemical signals of your neurons and synapses in the brain. So if sensations are brain processes, then everything's physical, because brain processes are physical, and the only thing that anybody thought was not physical were states of consciousness. So if we can reduce states of consciousness to physical configurations of the brain, then that means physicalism really is true, and everything about consciousness is merely a very complex physical arrangement of brain stuff. Okay, so that's his view. I hope it makes sense. I'm trying to make it seem clear to you. Jjc Smart, philosopher of the 20th and early 21st century, argues for physicalism by arguing that sensations are brain processes, where sensations are taken to be any state of consciousness. And again, those are reducible to physical conditions or states of the brain. Now, why is he so interested in making the case that sensations are just brain processes? Well, because if they weren't, right, if dualism was true, and the mind is something not physical, it's something that has no extension in space, so it's something that could even exist without the body being alive anymore. If that's true, if dualism is true and the mind and the body are different, then the mind and consciousness would forever be a mystery. It would be something that could not be explained scientifically or through physical science. And that would mean that it's something that he calls a nomological dangler. So let me add a new piece of terminology to our discussion here. Okay, so if sensations were not brain processes, but rather this mysterious activity of the non-physical mind, then that means they would be nomological danglers. And this is what the word nomological dangler means. A nomological dangler, he uses this term to refer to something that is not explained, something that remains unexplained by science and by physical science. Nomological dangler, something that remains unexplained by science. And Brandon, you say, isn't this kind of confirmed because of MRI scanning of brainwaves changing based on different simulations happening to the individual? I mean, sure, you know, Brandon, I tend to agree. There's been a lot of studies in neuroscience that seem to be able to map watch a brain scan while we ask a person or while we supply them with different kinds of mental states. You can say to the person, right now, think back to a memory of your childhood. And then we examine the brain scan and we can see like the characteristic regions of the brain where activity happens, whether it's in the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, parietal lobe, or whatever. So we do seem to have an increased understanding of how certain configurations of the brain are in relationship to different types of psychological condition, whether it's pleasure, pain, memory, anxiety, or anything else. But Brandon, it doesn't settle all the questions, because if somebody really believed that this proves that sensations are nothing other than brain processes, then that would convince perhaps a lot of people that there's no such thing as the soul, the afterlife, or like, you know, any of those heady concepts. So to some people that hold the view of dualism, like we've learned, Brandon, Descartes said that God makes sure that when you have clear and distinct perceptions, they must be true. I'm just playing, I don't know if I would call it devil's advocate, God's advocate. Can't we clearly imagine the mind and body existing separately? I mean, isn't that what the method of doubt has said? You're telling me that these doctors look at MRI scans, but how do you even know the doctors are real? Maybe it's just your consciousness dreaming the existence of those things. And so since it's possible to imagine your mind existing separately entirely from the body, wouldn't God make sure that that's a possibility? Or can't you just think of your mind and body existing separately? Don't you long for the idea of the afterlife and think it's possible? I'm just kind of trying to play God's advocate or devil's advocate, whatever. But I do agree with you for the most part, Brandon. So those are some, just a little bit of intellectual pushback or food for thought. But anyway, yeah. Nomological dangler, as I was saying, is just something that remains unexplained by science. And about the term nomological, it derives from Greek. The Greek word is nomos, which means of or pertaining to law. So nomological dangler would be something that seems to be dangling outside of our body of scientific knowledge. So I don't know if visual metaphors help you, but they do help me, so I'll try to give you one. Think of all of our scientific knowledge and understanding as sort of like a self-contained sphere of information. Everything that we know about scientifically is inside of that sphere. So like photosynthesis, gravity, you know, planetary orbits, I don't know, entropy, laws of thermodynamics, theory of relativity, quantum physics. It's all inside of this sphere. But if there's something that we don't understand, then it's like something dangling outside, floating around outside of there, and we can't yet pull it into the sphere of scientific understanding because it's a mystery. So these nomological danglers would be these random things that are as yet unexplained by science. And here's a question which maybe you can just give me your common sense response to this. Do you think that the scientific community likes for there to be nomological danglers, or would prefer to have a scientific explanation for things that are mysterious? Do you think that the nomological danglers are you know, things that scientists like or do not like? That's the question. Whether we think that there's some reasonable basis or not to have these things. Do you believe that scientists working in their community would prefer for there to be nomological danglers or not? Well, Brandon, you're giving me the wrong answer. Sorry, no. Nomological danglers are things that may drive science, but the goal of science is to eliminate them. Can we agree on that? I mean, the point would be for there to be an explanation for it, at least eventually. You know, so maybe you're saying they like them in the sense that it gives them subject areas to pursue further research for. But my question's a bit different. Would they like for there to be permanent nomological danglers? Would they like to concede the point that we will never have these explanations? No, okay? So if it was possible to give a scientific explanation of something that would have seemed mysterious, the scientists would prefer to have the physical or scientific explanation for it, rather than to just sort of shrug their shoulders and be like, I don't know, science will never figure that one out. So overall then, the author says, let's not say that consciousness is a nomological dangler. That's what dualism holds. The consciousness is completely outside the realm of the physical. It's not a physical object. It's not anything made out of matter. So that means that there's no way empirical science could ever investigate it because it's literally not physical. So it's not susceptible to any physical investigation or analysis. But what the author Smart, a physicalist himself, thinks is that no, consciousness and all the sensations that you have are just susceptible to physiological and neurological explanation because they're just brain states. So it doesn't want to concede that consciousness is a weird nomological dangler like the dualists say. Instead, he would prefer to claim that it is something that's physical. And the way he sees it, right, why should consciousness be a nomological dangler? Why should it be that physics and science, which increasingly is able to explain more and more of the reality that we live in, according to the basic physical laws and chemical constituents and electrical constituents of reality, why would consciousness be the thing that's left out of that picture that explains everything? I mean, it's like you would be saying, let science explain thermodynamics, entropy, gravity, photosynthesis, but when it comes to consciousness, no. leave that aside. That's just something that's a total mystery, and science can't touch that. No, he says science has the ambition, at least, whether we can achieve it, but science has the ambition of explaining everything in reality according to scientific and physical principles, not just most things or some things. So, as he sees it, it would be very weird if the universe we live in has natural and physical laws that govern everything except for just us and our consciousness. Why would that be the one exception? So, he believes sensations are just brain processes, therefore they are physical. And his goal and his method going forward now is that he's going to try and consider a whole bunch of different objections to that statement, that sensations are brain processes, okay? So as philosophers often do, we have the back and forth between an author's argument or position and then the criticisms and objections that come forward against it. And we see that again here. So he believes sensations are brain processes, but next he's going to tell us about what the criticisms of that might be. And the reason that he's going to tell us about these objections and criticisms is so that he can try to defeat them. So he's raising the objections that dualists may level against him so that he can try to blow them out of the water, show that they're not fatal objections to his own view. And then at the end, he'll pretty much conclude by saying, look, I've taken the best punch pretty much of these dualists. I've heard all their objections and I've pushed them to the sidelines because I've rebutted them. And therefore, since I've dismissed all the best dualist objections, there is no good reason for you to be a dualist, and you should instead side with the physicalist position that sensations are brain processes. Okay, so there's a range of objections then that he discusses, and he replies to each one. In the paper, there's 8 total objections, but for me teaching you it, I think that there's only a few that I need to really go over because some are more central than others, and I thought that some were more redundant and repetitive. So I'm going to kind of bounce around through these 8 objections and just talk to you about the ones that I thought were the most essential for his overall argument and his essay. So let's go into that now. But just so we're all clear, like major structural features of this paper and where it fits into our class. Dualists say there's a mind and a body and they're not the same. Jjc Smart says, no, everything's just made out of matter, and I'm a physicalist. So when you have sensations, that's really just the physical brain. And if you thought otherwise, then consciousness would be a nomological dangler, but those are weird and unscientific, so let's not say that it's a nomological dangler, let's just say sensations are brain processes. Now, he's prepared to take on the objections, and he's going to try and, overcome the objections, but we have to learn what they are. So, this is his statement that he believes and that he's defending, sensations equal brain process. And now we're going to look at objections to this identity statement. Like reasons that people would say, no, they are not brain processes. Okay, so here's objection 1. Objection 1 to his view. It's this. Sorry, let me get to this. So what he says is that an ordinary person can easily talk about their sensations, and we do that all the time. When you think about what you tell people and talk to people about, it's like 90% of human conversation is just talking about yourself, what you were experiencing. Like, oh, I just got the COVID shot, I was tired over the weekend, or oh, I just watched this Netflix thing and it was really funny, or oh, I'm studying for my classes and it's really tough, I need a study buddy, or whatever. You always are talking about what you're going through, how you're feeling, what it's like. So you can talk about your sensations in everyday language, and we do that all the time. That's just like a large portion of what we ever communicate about. But even though we can talk about our sensations, and everyone can, none of us can really say anything much about what is happening inside of our brain. And so to some people making this criticism, that shows you that they must not be the same thing, because I could talk to you about my sensations, but I cannot translate that into cognitive talk about the brain. Therefore, they must not be the same thing, the sensation and the brain process, because the way we talk about the two is way different. And most of us don't even know anything about what's happening, like under the hood, if you will, in the brain. So here we go. Objection 1. An ordinary person can easily talk about his sensations, but, and here's the point, but cannot say what is happening in their brain. So the objection goes, the two things must not be the same, the sensation and the brain process. Okay, so ordinary person can easily talk about his sensations or their sensations if you want to omit the masculine pronoun. An ordinary person can easily talk about their sensations, but cannot say what is happening in their brain. Cannot say what is happening in their brain. So the two things must not be the same. Okay? And again, to just sort of reiterate the idea, if I told you about, I don't know, this one time I ate like a really, really spicy meal. There's this place, Oro-chan Ramen, down in Little Tokyo in downtown LA. It's crazy. They've got this special called Special Number 2, and it's the spiciest thing you could ever eat. There's like a challenge that they give you where you have to try and eat it in 30 minutes, and if you can, they put on a timer, then you get a photo, Polaroid taken of yourself, you sign it, and it's put up on the like binder of like heroes or whatever, people who've actually been able to do it. It's very hard. But I'm like a big fan of spicy food, and so I did it twice. One time when I was really young back in college, and then I did it again in like 2016 or 17 a few years ago, but it was much harder, I don't know, for some reason as an older person now. Anyway, that second time I did it, I ended up kind of getting sick afterwards. I had to throw up because I was just too overwhelmed by the spice. This thing is insane. And I could tell you about that experience like I'm doing right now. Like I started to like, it was pretty crazy as I was saying, because I was rushing to eat all this like intense fiery broth. Like it's a huge pot of ramen and it's over the top spicy in 30 minutes. Towards the end of that 30-minute window, as I was finishing it, like my head was throbbing. I was like, I started to like lose auditory sensation. It was almost a little scary. I was like, damn, is this like gonna lay me down? Am I gonna faint? But I just ended up having to throw up. Anyway, that was an uncomfortable experience. And I'm telling you about it, how it was. But what I cannot tell you is what was going on in my brain. So I can't say to you, yeah, so as soon as I started eating it, there was like all this neurological activity right here in the left frontal lobe. And then over in the hippocampus, we saw like all kinds of dopamine receptors getting hit with blah, blah, blah. Like I could never tell you about that in any level of detail or accuracy because I simply just don't know what's happening in my brain. So here, the objection is saying, if you claim sensations are brain processes, then how come we can only talk about the sensation side of the identity? But we can't really say anything clear or concrete about the brain process side of it. Doesn't that mean they're not the same? If they were the same, shouldn't I be able to just switch back and forth between talking about the sensation in the subjective sense of how it was versus the objective sense of like what the brain is in its state? Well, anyway, that's the objection here. But the reply that he gives is good. So here is Jjc Smart's reply. He basically says, look, just because you have two different words or labels for something in language, that does not imply that they have to be two different things or that they have to refer to two different things. Okay, so just because there are two words or labels for something does not imply that they refer to two different things. Okay, I don't know if it's a little tricky to read, but I'll just type it just to be really sure about that. Here's the reply. It just says, just because there are two different words or labels for something does not imply that they refer to two different things. In other words, you can have two different labels for a thing and it refer to the same thing. Did that duplicate? I don't know why I did that, but anyway, twice typed in, same thing. Maybe to make sure that's not confusing, I'll just delete the second one. Okay, there you go, guys. So you see the reply, right? Here's an example that he gives to illustrate this point. Example given, e.g., well, I'll put it here in the chat because I'm out of room on the board. Example given, the morning star and, and quote unquote, the evening star. Okay, so the reply to this objection is that just because there are two different words or labels for something does not imply that they must refer to two different things. And take as an example the morning and the evening star. So here's a little true story. If you go back far enough in history, not too far back, but a couple hundred years ago, before we had the innovation of electricity and the light bulb, there was not like a lot of light pollution, obviously, back then. So even in big like urban centers, you'd have the ability at night to see like the full canopy of stars because there would be no light pollution blocking them out. And also in the early dawn, like early morning, there would still be some stars visible in the morning sky in the early dawn hours before the sun had fully come out. Okay, so people looking up at the night sky would look at the night sky and would see one star up there that seemed brighter than all the rest. And so they created a name for this star, which they called the evening star. So what's the evening star, everyone? It is the brightest star that you can see in the evening sky. Now, in the morning, like I was saying, there would still be some stars visible up there in the dim light of dawn. And because there was one star in the morning sky that was brighter than all the rest, they gave a name to it, and they called it the morning star. So now you guys know the evening star is the brightest star in the evening sky. And the morning star is the brightest star left over in the morning sky. Now, time passed, and better telescopes and methods of observation were developed, and it was finally discovered. Something was discovered. Now, I'll leave it to you guys to quickly give me a guess. If you're following this lesson and you're hearing my example, maybe you can guess what was discovered about the so-called morning and evening star. They learned through observation, more precise observation, that it is the same star. Yes, that's right, Kobe. It is the same star, just by two different names. In fact, to be really fully precise, it was not even a star. It's the planet Venus, which can appear as a star from the viewing conditions on the planet Earth. But anyway, people thought of it as two different stars until they discovered otherwise. So that, according to the author Smart, makes this point for him. Look, were there two different words here? Yes, there was morning and evening star. There were two different labels for the same object. But now hopefully we can recognize that despite that fact, there was just one star. It was not two different things merely on the basis that there were two different linguistic descriptions or words for it. So in the same way up here, sensations and brain processes. These are two different words or labels. And the way that we talk about sensations has nothing to do with the way that we talk about brain processes. But despite that, they're still just two words for the same thing, just like the morning and the evening star. There's a paper about this morning and evening star example. It's a famous paper by the German philosopher Gottlob Frege, who I really liked a lot. He's a philosopher of the 19th and early 20th century. Actually, my first ever published paper was about him back in the day. But you know, he has this funny example where he says, suppose you had one guy who's like a super night owl. He never gets up early. And another guy, they have an unlikely friendship, but he's friends with this super early bird morning person that never stays up late. So like evening man and morning man, they're having a conversation during some of the few hours they're both awake. And evening guy is like, hey, morning man, you know, you should stay up late one of these nights. I know you love to be up early in the morning, you hate being up late, but just come on, try it one time because I want you to see the evening star. You're missing out. Have you heard about it? And the morning guy's like, yeah, I've heard about it, but you know, I can't stay up that late. This is tough for me. But on the other hand, evening man, listen to me, come and get up with me one of these mornings early. I know you hate being up in the morning, you're not a morning person, but get up early because you're missing out on the morning star. Have you ever heard of this morning star? It's great, it's beautiful, it's bright. Evening guy's like, yeah, I guess I've heard of it, but I'll take your word for it. I'm gonna stick with the evening star because I'm not gonna get up like that. So anyway, you can stick with the morning, I'll do the evening star. It looks like they're talking about two different things, right? But what they don't know is that despite the different understandings they may have of the same object, it is still one and the same thing. So anyway, the objection claims that We talk about our sensations but don't know what's happening in the brain, so how could they really be the same thing? And the author is saying to you that, well, even if language makes it appear that they're different, and the linguistic way we speak about the two things seems different, it's still possible to have two totally different words or labels for one and the same thing. You know, so like take your mom, you could call your mom or my dad's wife, and those two terms don't have the same meaning, do they? Because your dad's wife, if you had like a stepmom, would be a different person than your biological mother. But suppose that, you know, you do have your two biological parents still married, then the words mom and dad's wife do refer to the same thing, even though they're two different words, which in theory could have referred to two different objects. So once again, he doesn't think that this is a great objection, because it's merely saying that, yeah, there's different words here and they don't seem to be used in the same ways. Talking about your sensations seems to have nothing in common with talking about brain processes. But despite this, if physicalism is true, then we should expect these two terms to refer to one and the same phenomenon, the brain process, despite the way that language makes it appear that there's different things. If I met someone at a party or whatever and I talk to them about myself and I introduce myself as Professor Vulich, and then I leave and I come back in a costume with like Hollywood makeup and like a voice change, and I address myself to them as like this musician named Richard, they might say, I met two really interesting and very different people at this party. One was a professor and one was a musician. One was named Professor Vulich, the other guy's name was Richard. They may think they're talking about two different people. But yet again, you hear the point that it's still just me presented to them in slightly different appearances. So language and the invention of more than one label for a given thing does not multiply it into two or three things. If I tell you I'm Professor Vulich, no, I'm the runner Vulich, or I'm a musician or whatever, I'm not turning myself into 2, 3, 4 different things. These are just more than one label for the same common object or idea. So there you hear his reply. Now, let me read a little bit from the book so you can see the author's way of putting the same point. The language he uses to express the objection is almost, I don't know, I always got to laugh at it because he uses such weird, bold language. He says, okay, saying the objection. Any illiterate peasant can talk perfectly well about his sensations or how things look or feel to him or about his aches and pains, and yet he may not know anything whatsoever about neurophysiology. A man may even believe that his brain is an organ which cools the body and still would be able to make true statements about his sensations. So therefore, the things we're talking about when we describe our sensations can't be processes in the brain. And now he has the reply right after. He says, okay, well, you might say as well that a nation of lazy people who never saw the morning star or knew of its existence, or who had never thought of the expression morning star, but who did use the expression evening star, could not use this expression to refer to the same entity referred to by the morning star. He also gives another example. So I gave you morning and evening star. Here's another one, lightning and electricity. So some people might not know anything about electricity. Certainly for a long time in history, nobody knew what even electricity really was or how to control it. But they would see lightning and they would say, hey, a big bright flash of something is in the sky. So there could be people who talk about lightning but can't tell you its electrical definition or description. Does that mean that lightning is something different from electricity? No. Lightning just is electricity as we would describe it more precisely in a physical or scientific sense. So as he says it here, a more plausible example, consider lightning. Modern physical science tells us that lightning is a certain kind of electrical discharge due to ionization of clouds of water vapor in the atmosphere. This is the true nature of lightning. And notice that there are not two different things, the flash of lightning and the electrical discharge. There's just one thing, the flash of lightning, which can be described scientifically as an electrical discharge. So it's not like when you have he says, it's not like having a footprint and a burglar. The footprint is like separate from the burglar, and it's an indication that the burglar was there. Electricity is just the same thing by two different names. It's not like two things that have a relation to each other. And so in the same sense, sensations just are brain processes. A sensation is not a sign of a brain process. It is exactly the same thing, okay? So just checking in with you guys. Is everything good? Is our connection stable and you can hear me and everything? Just want to kind of quickly make sure about that. Let me know. This lightning electricity example kind of hitting and making sense to you? I hope it is. Okay, thanks, Kobe. Just making sure, because I saw a momentary like little internet like bar went down, but it didn't seem to affect anything on our stream, so that's good. Okay, yeah. And furthermore, he says this. In short, the reply to objection 1 is that there can be statements of the form A is identical with B, and a person may well know that something is an A without knowing that it is a B. Like someone may know that this is a sensation without understanding that it's a brain process, or someone may know that this is lightning without understanding that it's the same thing as electricity. An illiterate peasant might well be able to talk about his sensations without knowing about his brain processes, just like he can talk about lightning even if he doesn't know that it's electricity. So anyway, that's his first objection and reply, little back and forth. And if you understood this first objection and the response, that's good, because that's really the core objection and reply that I think animates his whole paper. Some of the other objections and replies that follow afterwards kind of revolve around a similar theme. And so if I was going to point out like one core objection and response to really master and understand from this paper to get the core of it, it would be this one. So that's why I spent a lot of time on it. But let's go ahead and talk about a few of the others at least. I'm not going to go over all 8, but at least the ones, again, that I thought were the most important. So remember, this is his thesis, and these objections are against this thesis of his, and his replies are trying to defeat those objections. So objection 1, now objection 2. Objection 2 is very similar to number 1. What it just says is that the words the words sensation and brain process have different meanings, and therefore they must not refer to the same thing. So they must not be the same thing. Okay, so the idea is that if you look at these just as words, looking them up in a dictionary or something, you would not see the definition refer to the thing that the other definition refers to. A sensation would just say something like the qualitative nature of a person's experience. And a brain process, would say something like a particular neural configuration of the brain. And when you're talking in language, you don't switch between the two. It seems like their linguistic role of the words is quite different. So maybe that means they really can't be the same thing. But again, his reply is much similar to the first one. He just says, the objection only establishes that the words have different meanings. But as we have shown, two words can have different meanings, but still refer to the same thing. Okay, so again. Okay, so I won a 5K race in my age division in Dana Point in I think it was 2018. So I came in first, men aged like 30 to 35 division or whatever it was at the time, and because I won, that was nice. But I'm also a professor of philosophy in this class. So take these two descriptions or terms. Winner of the 5K in Dana Point 2018, philosophy professor of Intro to Philosophy, spring 2021 at Cal State Fullerton. Now, those two words or descriptions have totally different meanings. Like, there's nothing about being a philosophy professor that's mentioned in being the winner of that race, and vice versa. But even though those words don't have the same meaning, they obviously just refer to one and the same thing, which is me. And it's the same with the morning and the evening star. What's the definition of evening star? Brightest star in the evening sky. That is not the same definition or meaning as brightest star in the morning sky. But yet again, although the words mean different things, that doesn't necessarily mean that they refer to two different physical objects. So language can sometimes make us think that there are more things than there are simply by the invention of non-equivalent descriptions or words for the same thing. And he's saying that to all these criticisms that sensations are not brain processes because the words look different and they serve different roles in our lives, these words, once again, he just returns to the theme that that's simply language which is creating the appearance as though there's two distinct items being referred to by the words. So we can go to the next one. I'm going to jump over to objection 4. And so objection 4 is also kind of interesting. Here's what it says. It says that the sensations that you have no physical or spatial location. But the brain process clearly does have a physical location. Where else could it be? It's in your skull, in your brain. So if the sensation has no position in space, but the brain process does, then someone may say that's the reason that they're not the same. Okay, so sensations have no physical or what's the same, spatial location. But brain processes do. So they must not be the same. Okay, sensations, no physical location. Brain processes do, so not the same. Okay, and he has a reply. But let me first work on the objection itself for a minute longer. If I ask you right now to form in your mind right now a memory of whatever you were doing on New Year's Day. Okay, so right now it's whatever, almost May. Time flies, huh? But back on New Year's 2021, probably a lot of us weren't doing anything wild, I guess, because of the pandemic and lockdown and social distancing. But whatever you were doing, think about it right now in your head. Now, here's my question to you. Where is that mental image or memory at? Where is it? Where physically is it? Well, it's kind of a trick question, guys, because let me take it step by step. Is this memory you're having right now out there in the room, in the environment, in the space outside of your body? No. It's not like you start thinking of it and a little hologram pops up in space in front of you and we can all see it. So clearly your memory is not like located physically anywhere outside of you. But also, is it inside of you physically? I mean, that's sort of weird to say too, because if somebody was to like dissect your body right now as you're having this memory, they're not going to find the memory. They're not going to like open your skull and be like, oh, there I see it playing. They're just going to see the brain, the tissue, all the like blood and everything else that's inside of you. They're not going to see your psychological experiences. So if I'm asking you right now to think of like, I don't know, the face of your mother, like right now I'm thinking of my mother's face, but that face is not appearing anywhere in space. It's not appearing like literally inside of my body. You couldn't find it. You wouldn't see the way my mother's face looks by cutting me up and looking all through my body, nor would you see it projected outside of me. So it seems like these sensations, in a way, if you follow the objection, they're like nowhere. There's nowhere you can find them. They're not outside, they're not inside, they're purely mental and they have no physical position. But what about a brain process? Clearly the brain process has a position. Where is it? Well, where else could it be? It's in the skull. That's where the brain physically is sitting. So all your brain processes are right up there. But where are the sensations at? I can't find them. So it could be argued that whereas one is in space and the other is not, that means they're not the same kind of thing. Here's another example. I gave you the case of like, think of a memory. I think that's a good example, but let me use the one of the author just to kind of make sure his example makes sense to you too. He talks about after images. Now this is an optical phenomenon that happens when you look at a light source for just a brief moment and then close your eyes. Okay, so right now, I mean, I'm sitting right under a chandelier, and there's light bulbs right up in there. If you have any kind of light bulb or light source nearby to you, I would just ask, as you can learn about this by doing it yourself, Look at that light source for just a brief half split second. I don't want you to hurt your eyes, but look at it and then close your eyes. Can you notice this? That the faint outline of the light source remains imprinted into your closed field of vision for just a while. So like if I'm looking at the light bulb in my kitchen light fixture right there, and I close my eyes, I'll see the purplish tint outline of it in my closed field of vision for a little while. Because of the impact of the photons on your retina, it leaves the impression behind for just a little bit. So we can call this an after image. He uses this as his example of a sensation among others that he could have chosen. Now, think about that after image. Where is it, right? That's another way to look at it. Where is the after image? Is the after image outside of you? Of course not. Will we find it by looking through your own body? Of course not. I use the after image. I like to go with dreams and stuff because there's more detail, right? If you had a dream, I can't see it and it's nowhere in space, but also it's not to be found inside of you literally by like going through the physical content of your body. Okay, so you heard the objection. Sensations don't seem to have any physical location, but the brain process does, so maybe they're not the same. But his reply to that, it's again just pretty much of a piece with the other responses. He simply says that the sensation is a brain process, and therefore the sensation does have a physical location in the brain. So if the sensation does have this location in the brain, how come we didn't think that or say such a thing, at least according to the intuition of the objection? Well, it's because we're in the habit of not necessarily referring to the physical nature of what our conscious states are. You know, we just are conscious beings, so we just talk about our sensations in everyday informal conversational language. It's only when you're like doing philosophy or neuroscience that you would ever stop to say, oh yeah, I have a memory, and by the way, it's up here in like the memory center of my prefrontal cortex. In an ordinary conversation with someone, if they ask you, hey, how was New Year's? You would just tell them how it was, and you wouldn't like pause for a moment to say, and by the way, did you know that all these memories I'm reporting on, they're up here in this head? That would, to most people, strike them as an odd and unnecessary comment, an awkward thing to say, and it wouldn't suit the normal purposes of a conversation, but that does not mean that it's literally false. So once again, he says, our linguistic habits and conventions of conversation and speech make it seem as though we can't place the sensation anywhere in space. But if it is equivalent to a brain process, then it actually does have a physical location, and we simply don't have a habit of mentioning that, because what would be the point, except for when you're considering the philosophy of mind and the deep question as to whether or not all these sensations that you experience on a regular basis are merely something physical or whether they aren't. So he doesn't find this to be a very bad objection that derails his thesis again. Now there's just a couple more, I guess, that I wanted to go over. Like I say, I'm not covering all of them, so that's why I'm kind of jumping around a bit. But we're going to next talk about his objection, well, not his objection, but the objection number 6. Okay. Okay, so objection 6. Objection 6 is this idea that the sensations that you have, they're private, meaning they cannot be observed by others. They're not available for public observation. But brain processes, at least in theory, can be observed by others, because we could just perform a brain scan and look at the centers of the brain that are being activated in a given situation. So if the brain process can be looked at, but not the sensation that you're having, then maybe that means they're not the same. Okay, so sensations cannot be publicly observed. But brain processes can. So according to the objection, they must not be the same thing. Okay. And we'll get to his reply, but first let me explain a little more. So if I'm asking you to form a mental image of your mom's face, I can't see the image. Like, I have no idea what your mom's face looks like, even if right now I know you're thinking of it yourself. And so can we understand that point? Like, it's vice versa. I'm thinking of my mom's face, and you don't know anything about what her face looks like. At least you can't tap into my mental space and like see what I'm seeing in my mind's eye. So my memories, sensations, pleasures, pains, whatever they are, I talked about the face of my mother, sure, but I could have said something else, like if I'm in pain because I have an injury on my elbow or foot or something, you cannot observe my feeling of pain from your third person perspective. Maybe you could get a similar injury, but then you'd be feeling your own pain, not mine. So my sensations, whatever they are, they're really only available for me to experience and to see and to perceive. For other people that are third parties relative to me, others, they can only hear about my sensations when I report them to them, but they cannot, like, just, of course, from the first person point of view, see them themselves. So your sensations are kind of locked away in the private domain of your own cognitive psychology. But a brain process can be observed by other people. Like a neuroscientist could say, I need to take a brain scan to see what part of your brain maybe has some impaired neurological function. And so we're going to look at that, and we're going to watch what the brain scan shows. During the brain scan, you could be having any number of memories, thoughts, associations. Maybe they even ask you to have some. And then we could see how that corresponds to what is shown on the chart. So again, the objection is saying a sensation must not be a brain process, because this is something that we can just objectively observe, but this is only subjectively available to the person who had it. So what about that? Doesn't that mean they're not the same thing? Well, his reply, once again, is kind of a piece with the others, as I've said before. He just says this is yet again a linguistic difference. The language that we use to talk about the sensation is different from the language that we use to talk about a brain process, but nonetheless, they're still the same thing. But they are the same. Okay, so it says the language used to discuss a sensation is different from the language used to discuss a brain process, but nonetheless, those two things are still the same. So when we talk about our sensations, we employ the subjective language of sensation talk. Here's how it was for me, how I felt, what it was like in my experience. When we talk about a brain process, we rather employ the language of an objective physical report of the object. So the third person objective physical description of the sensation is when we talk about the brain process. The first person subjective experience of that brain process, we use the language of a personalized report of how it was to you. And so these are two different roles that language can play, talking about something from the first person experiential perspective versus talking about it from the sort of third person physical brain objective perspective. But yet again, just because language offers us these two different avenues with which to describe the same process does not necessarily mean that it has to be two different things. And so it's yet again this kind of common theme that language makes it seem like there's two things, but there's just one in the end. Now there's two more objections, but I think that there's only one more that I really, really wanted to focus on for us. So let's go into that. It's objection 7. And I think of this 7th one as kind of like, if you will, Descartes' objection, because it's an objection that a dualist like Descartes would make. And so here's what it is. Objection 7 says, but I can imagine myself having sensations even if I didn't have any body or brain. You know, like in the meditations, I can imagine myself having thoughts, even if this was all a dream and there's no such thing as the body. So if I can imagine myself having thoughts and sensations, etc., with no body, then they must not be the same thing. Because obviously, if they were the same thing, then you couldn't have thoughts without the brain. If the brain is the same thing as the sensation, then where there's no brain or no functioning brain, there wouldn't be any consciousness. But if you can imagine yourself having consciousness with the body totally not there at all, then maybe that means they're not the same thing. So here I'll put the objection. I can imagine myself having sensations even if I had no body. And of course, if you had no body, you have no brain, so / brain. So therefore, sensations must not be brain processes. And he has a reply for this too. I think his reply here is quite clever and effective. But the objection yet again says, I can imagine myself having feelings, thoughts, and sensations, even if I was totally disembodied, even if I was just a soul with no body, or even if I was just dreaming that I had this body. So since that's a conceivable idea, the idea of the separate existence of mind versus body, then sensations and conscious states must not be brain processes, because if I can imagine them existing with no brain, clearly that must mean that they're not identical to the brain process. But what's his reply here? Well, what he says in response is, as we've talked about earlier, but I can also imagine that, like, the morning star is not the evening star, but it is. So just because I can imagine the idea that these two different descriptors refer to different things, that does not always mean that it's true. Same with lightning and electricity. I could imagine that lightning has nothing to do with electricity, that it's just a big bright flash that's caused by something other than electricity. Even though I can imagine this, it still remains true that it just is electricity. So conceivability is not always a window or an indicator of whether two things actually are separate. So he's kind of rejecting Descartes' intuition there, that because you can clearly imagine the mind and the body existing separately, they must be two different things. Because if that principle held true, then anytime you could imagine two different things existing separately, they would have to be different things. But in the morning and the evening star case, we have an obvious counterexample to that. So anyway, I can also imagine that the morning star is not the evening star, but it is. Not only can you imagine that the morning star is not the evening star, but people did believe that for a long time until we actually were able to discover otherwise. So according to the objection, that should mean that they're two different things, but obviously they're not. So the proof then is in the counterexample. He thinks that that's not a real fatal objection to his overall position. And he has one more interesting thing to say here right at the end. He says, okay, to anybody who believes that you could have consciousness with no body, right? Like you could have a disembodied consciousness, like say in the afterlife, or if you were right now even having the illusion of the body itself, then some people think of that. It's possible to have consciousness with no body whatsoever. Well, if that's what you believe, then Jjc Smart says it's kind of like you believe that consciousness is like a ghost. It's like believing in ghosts, because what you're saying is you think consciousness could just somehow escape the body and continue to exist, having thoughts, perceptions, etc., with no body attached at all. So he says, if that's what you believe, you have to admit that you do believe that like consciousness comes from like a ghost, not necessarily from the brain, but it comes out of this ghost that's somehow inside you or related to you. And he says, look, if that's the theory of consciousness that you want to hold, the ghost theory instead, well, he says, you have to compare that to other alternatives. And in a way, I cannot totally disprove the ghost theory of human consciousness. But he says, what I can tell you is that it's not the only theory, and another one is the physicalist theory called the brain theory of consciousness. So he says, fair enough, put them both on the same table, and then you can just make your decision. Do you prefer the brain theory or the ghost theory of consciousness? But as he sees it, there's way more empirical and scientific evidence for the brain theory of consciousness than for the ghost theory. And so he kind of leaves it at that. He says, you're hearing a physicalist description of consciousness, which says it's just brain processes. And you're hearing a dualist description of consciousness, which says it's coming out of a ghost or something that doesn't even need the body. But if those are your two options, just decide on the basis of what's more reasonable and based on evidence. And he thinks the brain theory is way more consistent with what we know about, you know, the functioning of our consciousness and the brain. I mean, we talked about some of these earlier, Brandon, and I think now would be the right time to bring them back. Like, isn't it evidence that consciousness is rooted in the brain, that like chemical changes to the introduction of certain drugs to different receptor sites of the brain results in altered consciousness? Why should it be that your consciousness changes when physical chemical interactions happen with respect to this brain if the consciousness is separate from the body? Or what about traumatic head injuries? Somebody suffers a terrible injury resulting in changes to their cognitive function. If the brain is not necessarily the basis of consciousness, then why should physical events that occur with it change the nature of the consciousness that someone experiences afterwards? So, I mean, there seem to be valid reasons to assume that the brain is a source of consciousness, and he says the ghost theory is not as credible or well based on evidence. So here's what I'll read, and then we'll be done with this. So the objection says, I can imagine myself even turned to stone and still having images, aches, pains, and so on. His reply, well, I can imagine that the electrical theory of lightning is false. I can imagine that lightning is just purely optical phenomenon. I can imagine that lightning is not electricity. I can imagine that the evening star is not the morning star, but it is. And then he goes down a little further and he says, I suspect that my critic thinks that experience is coming from a ghostly entity. On his view, our sensations are composed of ghost stuff, and on mine it is composed of brain stuff. And going a little further, he says, the dualist cannot really say that an experience is coming from nothing. So they say that it comes from a sort of ghost stuff. I say that this is a coherent position, but I say that experiences are not identified with ghost stuff, but rather brain stuff. This is another hypothesis, and it's very plausible. So he kind of says, take your choice then, but there's no reason that the brain theory is worse off than this odd ghost theory of consciousness. But again, I mean, if you follow Descartes' arguments, then maybe you would have a reason to disagree with Jjc Smart. These are just arguments on both sides, and you're the judge, really, about how much convincing power they each have relatively. So I think that's pretty much it from Jjc Smart's paper. In the end, he thinks, rebutted all these various objections to the claim that sensations are brain processes. Having, he thinks, effectively dismissed them all with reasonable replies, that leaves us with this outcome, that there's no very compelling criticisms of physicalism, and there's no powerful arguments that would require you to be a dualist. So in the absence of such compelling and convincing arguments, he holds that physicalism is more reasonable, and it avoids having any nomological danglers when it comes to the idea of consciousness. So that's it for Jjc Smart. We obviously are running low on time, but I would like to at least tell you about the final author on the philosophy of mind that we will cover on Tuesday when we resume. And after that, we're down to the last topic in the class, which is life and death. So for that, you should try to read the work of Plato on the harmony of the soul, and that'll be the first piece in that final topic of the course. But anyway, one more author on philosophy of mind is this guy, Alan Turing. And Alan Turing lived from 1912 to 1954. In 1950, he wrote this paper we will study called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. Computing Machinery and Intelligence by Alan Turing from 1950. Alan Turing is a very important person who I think should be a more well-known household name because he is the inventor of the digital computer. And when you consider how revolutionary the digital computer is as a device that we use every day all the time, that we're using right now, the impact of it on human civilization cannot really be overstated. So he's had a major impact on the world, working in some of the earliest computer programming languages and to develop some of the earliest digital computing devices. He also played a key role in helping the Allies defeat the Axis powers and the Nazis in World War II. So he was a British citizen, and because of his technical skill in computer programming languages and such, he was able to decode cryptographs that were being used by Nazis to send messages. So he was able to basically decode these messages, intercept them, and then use them to assist the Allies in defeating Nazi Germany. So he had a big role in the development of the computer, and also making sure that we persevered against fascism and Nazism in World War II. And now, Jerry, you mentioned an interesting touchstone of pop culture. The one area where I think he has received more wide recognition and cultural acknowledgement is in the film The Imitation Game, which did come out a few years back. And Benedict Cumberbatch portrayed Alan Turing in the movie, and he won the Best Actor Oscar award for his depiction. So that's a cool movie too. It doesn't really focus as much on his exploits in computer programming, more his personal life and his work as a code breaker. But anyway, that's a great film and an Oscar-winning performance. So another thing I'll just say about his biography, because we won't be able to jump into his actual essay today, and I only have a few minutes. He was a gay man, and at the time that he lived, obviously this was a huge taboo, even in Western society. And there were even laws in Britain at the time that made it a prosecutable offense under like perversion laws that existed then. So someone, I guess, reported him as a gay person, and he was put on trial. And they forced him to take a cocktail of drugs that would like chemically castrate him, meaning that it would eliminate his sexual drive and his libido. And then he died, as you can tell, at a pretty young age. He died of cyanide poisoning, which some people speculate could have been foul play for whatever reason, but I guess officially it's ruled as suicide. But anyway, he leaves behind a big legacy, the computer, and his instrumental role in helping defeat the Nazis in World War II. But we're going to learn a little bit about his actual ideas. So in the paper, just last word, he's arguing that machines will someday be able to think and have consciousness like us. So he, as the creator of the computer, speaks with, I think, a considerable level of insight as a pioneer of that technology. And he says that it's not going to be too far into the distant future that we will have conscious and thinking machines like you've maybe seen in science fiction films. So if what he's saying is true, then maybe when you guys are older and your grandkids are running around, they're going to be having like robot friends that are just the same as people and that, hang out with you and that are like regarded as having consciousness and thought. But other people don't think that's possible at all. So we'll hear his argument that machines could someday think and what it would take for them to do that. And we'll also learn about what the objections might be, why people say, no, it's not even possible. No matter what the machine is doing, it's not really conscious. So we'll look at that, and then we'll be done with philosophy of mind, and then we'll transition into the question of what makes a life go well, and that'll be our last couple of authors. So for now then, guys, thanks again for hanging in there, and we're right at the end, so stick with it for another few weeks. If you need anything, let me know, but for now, let's just close the stream, if that's okay. Let me know that you're good to go, and then I'll see you after the weekend. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Rudy. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Appreciate your attendance as usual. So I'll see you then after the weekend, and if you do need anything, as always, just email me, and I'll try to be in touch. Okay, then. Have a good one. See you next time. Bye-bye.